Well, hello, stream.
Chapter Chapter 9. Chapter 9. 9. And I shall need to cancel all the reservations I hold with inns around the city as well, Lilith was saying, as she bustled around Theron's apartment, picking up items and examining them to decide whether or not they should be packed. Theron made a vague noise of agreement, though truthfully her mind was leagues away, her thoughts still somewhere in Feldemar. In her hands she turned over the notice of enlistment that she had signed, a worryingly flimsy piece of paper for something that would apparently decide the course of her entire future. Theron? Theron! She looked up, finally shocked out of her contemplation, as Lilith clicked her fingers to get Theron's attention. Forgive me, I was just thinking. Are you having second thoughts? Lilith frowned, concerned, but Theron shook her head. It all just seems so unreal. Would you have imagined yesterday that this was where we would be now? It feels like an elf tale, only everything seems to be going well, which worries me even more. Lilith came over and placed a hand on her cheek, her fingers cool and calming. It seems time that something in your life went well, my dear. You shall have to get used to it, or at the very least appreciate it while you have it. Theron grinned as she nuzzled against her hand. It may well be that it will feel less like a cunning trick when we ride into the war and things become terrible again. We shall see, but in the meantime I will try this appreciation you speak of. You should, Lilith retorted, but smiled coquettishly. Theron had just slid a hand around Lilith's waist when a familiar creak told them the downstairs door into the apartment was being opened, followed by footsteps clomping up the stairs. They both sighed disappointedly. Theron swung the door open midway through Eben conducting their special coded knock, shocking him, but it was, she felt her heart leap with a small burst of excitement as the thought occurred to her, entirely unnecessary now. Imara herself could have walked into the building, and the notice of enlistment would have been enough to send her packing. Theron hoped it would not come to that, however, since the day had been overwhelming enough already. Come in, she told him, seeing that Calum was behind him on the stairs as well. The two boys entered dutifully, both looking on in mild bewilderment at Lilith, who was still taking things down off shelves and packing them into one of two trunks. You have reached a decision, I take it? Eben looked at her curiously as he removed his cloak. There was only ever one real option to take, Theron answered wryly, but she indicated the enlistment notice still in her hand. I am now an agent of the High King, or will be when I am sworn in at the stronghold in Feldemar. This is wondrous news! Calum clapped his hands excitedly, but then stopped abruptly, struck by some realization. But does this mean... Yes, I am leaving the seat, she replied, carefully rolling up her documentation and placing it on a table nearby. Or rather, we both are. Lilith somehow managed to convince them that the family Yaren would be very upset if she was not brought along as well. Lilith snorted, though her voice did sound smug when next she spoke. There are those in the Red Cloaks who would jump off a bridge if it seemed it would please my family. It was a small task. You might have told me first, Theron shot back, amused. I thought I had gone there to sign my life away. I almost fled twice. Lilith came over and patted her on the cheek again, smiling sweetly. and miss seeing the look on your face. Never. Calem's small brown eyes had immediately glistened with tears upon hearing the news, and he now ran over and hugged them each in turn. I cannot believe that you will be so far away. How can they... But you must... Oh, I will miss both of you. Lilith looked shocked to be included in his affection, and even more so at his embrace, but Theron patted him on the head fondly, touched by his words. In contrast to Calem, Eben was more subdued, his expression a combination of surprise, wonderment, and regret, all at once. "When do you leave?" he asked brightly, obviously trying to force himself to appear more cheerful than he felt. "Tonight," Lilith responded, shaking her head. "I have so much to do, but they expect us there by sunset. I may have to leave instructions." Calem gasped. "Tonight? Truly? I had not thought all the mystics would sail at once. You cannot be gone by tomorrow. Will we even get a chance to say farewell?" The shock was great enough to cause his tears to stop, leaving him gaping in horrified astonishment, and Theron felt a lump rise in her throat as he spoke. For the first time, the reality of having to leave her friends began to sink in. There would be no more time spent together in the mornings here at the apartment, no more trips to Eben's family estate in the city, not even laughing at the two boys as they turned up their noses at the Crimson Jib's food. "Well," Theron began, and then cleared her throat, trying to keep her voice from cracking. "Well, you are here now, are you not?" "This is hardly a proper farewell," Calem wailed, hugging her again. She scowled over his head, not just because her bruises still pained her, but also in an attempt to stop tears from springing to her own eyes. "I hardly think you need to worry," she told him gruffly. "I shall write to you if you wish, when I think of you. Whenever I see overlarge stacks of books and am reminded of your face behind them, for example." "Oh, yes, please write. You must tell us all about Feldemar," he bubbled, caught up in the emotion. "Calem is right, though," Eben interrupted, moving aside for Lilith to pass with one of the trunks. "We should have a proper farewell. We could fetch Adara and go down into the city, have a proper celebration for your newfound freedom from your patron." "Oh, yes, a party," Lilith cooed, looking more excited than Theron had seen her in a long while. "I still have so much to do, but if you give me a few hours, we could all meet up at a tavern in the city." "I hardly think that I will make a good impression on my new colleagues if I show up to the harbor drunk," Theron pointed out sardonically. "Oh, hush," Lilith teased, obviously already set on the idea. "Only enlisted for an hour, and already you have turned into a stick in the mud. You can refrain from drinking if it bothers you so much. They will have to take me, whether drunken or no." "You can at least eat," Eben added, amused. "I am sure the rations the mystics will feed you will pale in comparison to the food available here on the seat. You should savor good meals while you still have them." For the second time in less than an hour, Theron had been encouraged to throw herself into the appreciation of what she already possessed. In some ways that frightened her, as though both Lilith and Eben feared that she might lose it all at any moment, and they would have been within their rights to do so, given where she was traveling to and what her new profession would be. But it was also comforting, this knowledge that the people in her life truly wanted to be there. "I am rather hungry," she admitted eventually. Calem wrinkled his nose. "Not that awful sailor's tavern, though. Anywhere else would be better." "Well, now that I no longer need to hide, we can go wherever you would like, my picky young friend," Theron told him, grinning. "As long as it is your coin that will pay the innkeeper." He grimaced at the thought. "Suddenly I do not miss you quite so much." Eben, who had up until that point been watching Lilith folding clothes, suddenly stood up straighter, as though he had just remembered something. He came over and hugged Theron, kissing her on both cheeks as was the Idrisian custom, and hurriedly collected his cloak. "Well, that is settled then," he said, pulling it around his shoulders. "I must go and find Adara. What say we... I must go and find... must. I must go and... I must go and find a daughter. What say we meet at the Silver Stag, where I brought you all to meet her first? In several hours, did you say, Lilith? Yes, I have to speak with my instructors at the academy still to formally request a leave of... I shall see you all then, he called out, as he fairly bolted down the stairs and out the door. Do you think he knows that he is as subtle as a battering ram? Lilith asked dryly, and Calum snorted in amusement. It is a pity we did not bring him to the mystics as well, that they might deploy him against Dalmoon, Theron added, and they all dissolved into laughter. Laughter. On the top floor of the Silver Stag Inn, alongside its most luxurious rooms, the proprietors had seen fit to have several private dining areas installed. They mostly lay unused during the winter months because they were open to the sky, set out on balconies framed with trellises of delicate climbing roses and honeysuckle vines to ensure privacy. But now, in summer, they were highly sought after, especially by travelers from Idris or Wavemount, where dining in the open air was considerably more common due to the climate. Theron could not even begin to imagine how much coin Theron could not even begin to imagine how much coin Eben and his lover Adara must have offered the staff in order to secure the use of one of them that afternoon. The food, she did have to admit, was entirely worth it, with a rich spread of crisp meats and roasted vegetables, soft Idrisian flatbread, and spicy stew from Feldamar that made everyone's mouths burn, followed by a sumptuous array of candied fruit and nuts from Calenton for dessert. There was nowhere in all of the 9 lands, the tavern-master Kanda assured them smoothly, that could procure such a varied banquet of foods from so many different cultures. She thought about this as they all lay around on the balcony, bellies groaning under the weight of all the food they had eaten. She realized that she did not truly know much about anywhere else in all of Underrealm. Even Selvin, where she had lived as a child, was a distant memory to her. Just dirty streets and high walls and uncaring adults busy with their own concerns. She had a fleeting wish to see as much of it as possible, although she would prefer to only visit Hedgemond in the summer, being no great fan of frigid winters. She wondered briefly if her time with the mystics would take her all over the 9 kingdoms, for it was often said that the Red Cloaks traveled far and wide dispensing the king's justice. It seemed possible, but so did being mired in Feldamar for as many years as it took the High King's armies to defeat Dalmoon. The scope of possibilities that her future might hold had been widened beyond what she had ever dreamed, but also narrowed immeasurably by her newfound duty. If she was lucky, she thought, that duty might bring her back to the High King's seat someday, to these cream-colored buildings that glowed in the light of the setting sun, and the ubiquitous smell of the sea and the views of the palace in the distance, to this place that was almost all she had ever known. "I feel I have nearly eaten my own weight in chestnuts," Calum moaned and clutched at his stomach, curling up in a ball. "You will need to roll me home, for I fear I cannot walk." Theron laughed, but in truth she, too, was feeling extremely full. "I hope you will not bounce too many times down the stairs." They had spent the time talking and laughing, occasionally busying themselves with food when the conversation threatened to focus too much on the inevitable parting that was to come. She had felt tears spring into her eyes often, and was glad that her reaction to the peppery Feldamarian food made her eyes water enough to hide that fact. After all, She had a reputation to maintain. She could see Lilith glancing at the skyline every now and then, obviously judging the time. She could see Lilith glancing at the Lilith glanced. Lilith glancing at. She could see Lilith glancing at the skyline every now and then, obviously judging the time and how long they had before they would have to leave. So, it seemed, did Adara, since she eventually took pity on them all and stood, being the one to call their meal to a close when no one else was willing. Laying her fine brown hands upon Calem's shoulders, Adara helped him to struggle to his feet. "Come, young lord, you and I and Mistress Yeren shall go and settle our account with the tavern master. I believe that Eben has something he wishes to speak with Theron about in private." Lilith raised her eyebrows at Theron, who shrugged. Calem, still complaining, stumbled his way to the stairwell at Adara's side, and Lilith joined them, while Eben came over to sit beside her, the two of them looking out over the city. "I wish you all the best with the mystics," he said morosely, looking at the ground, and she nudged him gently with an elbow, though his tone of voice made her wish for more spicy food. "Sky above, Eben, you have been mysterious and mournful all day. What is the matter?" "Other than you leaving?" he pointed out dryly, and she shrugged again. "It just seems more than that." "Do you think I have made a mistake?" "No, not at all." He paused, looking away for a moment before once again meeting her eyes. "But I fear I have made many. Some that led to this. I did not think. I feel shame that my wrongdoings have set you on this path when it is so perilous, especially given what you have already endured." She stared at him for a moment and then sighed. "I will carry the weight of my own actions, Eben. You have enough to deal with without punishing yourself over me as well." He smiled, but shook his head. "I knew you would say that. I only hope you will be safe. Promise me that you will write, even if only to complain." "Did you really think that I would not have written you letters detailing my complaints about my new life?" A grin softened her retort. "I expect I shall begin drafting one several heartbeats after I board the ship for Feldemar. I have never liked ships." He laughed, but his eyes were still sad. "I just hope there will be good in your new life also. I hope you make many new friends, even though I would not wish you to forget us." She snorted. "I hardly think I will fit in with the Red Cloaks." "Ah, but remember you did not think you would fit in with us either." He chuckled, and she spread her hands helplessly. "It is hardly my fault that you and Calem would not leave me alone." "That you and Calem would not leave me alone." "Would not leave me alone." "You and Calem would not leave me alone." "It is hardly my fault that you and Calem would not leave me alone." He laughed again, more genuine this time. "I have something for you." From inside the small satchel he had brought with him, he pulled out a thick bundle wrapped in plain brown paper. She took it curiously, trying to discern what it might be through the wrapping, and thought that it had the weight and texture of something made from cloth. "I hope you like it," he continued anxiously. "I did not know what to do with the idea I had, so Adara picked the style of it." She paused in unwrapping the paper to smile at him. "Was this why you dashed out of my apartment earlier? You did not have to get me anything, truly." She gasped as she removed the last of the paper, awestruck. It was a cloak, a red cloak, like all those in the Order wore. But she had rarely seen a cloak so fine as this one, and especially not on a mystic, though differing styles and materials were common enough. It was made of a heavy fabric, almost like canvas, but of such fine cut that she knew it must have been expensive. Strangely, it seemed to be not quite as wide as she would have expected for its length, and though it had a buttoned sleeve for an armhole, there was only one. "It is for dueling," the tailor said. Eben explained, holding it up to show how it should hang. The sword arm is kept free, but the heavy cloth around the other can be used to catch a blade or redirect it in imitation of a shield. I thought if you should see any fighting that it might be of assistance. She stood up and struggled into it, fumbling with setting. She stood up and struggled into it, struggled into it, struggled into it, into it, into it. Struggled into it. She stood up and struggled into it, fumbling with setting the collar comfortably and fastening the tie that would keep it in place. It felt oddly heavy at first, and it would likely not be much use as a warm traveling cloak, but it was almost regal in how much it swayed and flourished when she moved. Let us hope that the enemies will not target me first out of jealousy for my excellent sense of fashion. She grinned once more as she swished the cape around dramatically, and he sighed in exasperation and rolled his eyes.
Hey, what's up, Barry?
If you do not like it, it is a marvelous gift, she interrupted, relenting, and then hugged him. Truly, I will wear it in honor of you and Caleb and Adara. It is perfect. This seemed more practical than having an entire suit of armor forged for you, he joked as they broke apart, and she smiled once more. I will be fine, Ebon. Remember to take care of yourself as well, wherever your mission with Dean Foradar will take you. He made a face. So far it has led only to libraries, but I will watch for particularly vicious dust mites, if that will set your heart at ease. She laughed, thinking that it would be just Ebon's luck to discover the world's only dangerous dust mites, as the others returned.
I'm doing great. Gonna put in a couple hours on audiobook tonight before I go to bed.
Lilith gazed in wonder at the cloak, as did Caleb, while Adara clasped their while Adara Caleb, as did Caleb, while Adara as did Caleb, while Adara clasped as did Caleb, while Adara clasped Theron's hands fondly and kissed her on both cheeks, smiling. I fear it is now time for us to leave, Theron said, smiling sadly as she turned to look at the view of the seat in all its sunlit splendor, just one last time.
Okay, time to move to a new recording session.
Chapter 10. Chapter 10. Though the late afternoon was still balmy from the heat of the sun, the breeze blowing in off the sea was uncommonly cold.
Actually, before I get into this, I'm going to go fill my coffee.
Though the late afternoon was still balmy from the heat of the sun, the breeze blowing in off the sea was uncommonly cold as Theron and the others made their way down to the pier where they had been told to meet Vivian. It seemed an ill omen, but Caleb assured her that the sea was often thus, and that cold air would mean stronger winds, which would make their journey shorter. She perked up a bit at the idea of that, not keen to spend more than a week trapped on board a floating death trap, but none of the sailors seemed to share Caleb's optimism. "They certainly seem a dour lot," Eben noted, as if reading her mind, as they passed a group of dockhands loading weapons onto one of the ships. "They are afraid," Adara explained softly, as they stood aside to let a group of men struggle past, carrying a large, heavy crate. "Many sailors from Selvin were contracted to carry the mystics to Feldamar, when Dolmoon even now raids the Selvin coast to the east. Most wish to return and defend their homes." Caleb raised an eyebrow at her. "I did not know that you were so well informed on matters of the war, Adara." The sly smile she gave him in return made Theron laugh. "Why, young lord, I did not think I would have to educate you on the habits of sailors and soldiers. Many consider the Guild of Lovers a first stop in any town they visit." He muttered something inaudible, cheeks turning bright red with embarrassment, and pulled the hood of his cloak up to hide his face. They passed by long, wide ships into which the deckhands were loading horses, having to coax the animals gently to get them to put hooves on the wooden ramps, and smaller ships with fewer sails that appeared to be for scouting ahead of the rest of the fleet. All around them, members of the Order scurried about on errands with a strange kind of shared zeal, like ants in a nest. Theron could not imagine how chaotic it would be disembarking once they all reached Feldamar. They eventually found Vivian standing only a few berths from the far end of the harbor, where they were sheltered somewhat from the chill of the cold sea air by the rocky face of this end of the inlet. She smiled brightly at their approach, her cheer a stark contrast to the rest of the mystics, and waved at a nearby dockhand to take their luggage from them. Theron's stomach lurched once more as she realized that this was it. Some of the ships, particularly the smaller ones, were already making headway, the wind billowing in their sails and the sailors sounding their horns as they made their departure. Vivian gave her a knowing look and then took her leave, disappearing in the direction of the gangplank. "Well," Theron said, turning to face her friends, "I suppose this is farewell." Caleb dashed forwards to hug her once more, his bottom lip trembling heavily as tears glistened in his eyes. "Take care of yourselves." She mustered a smirk as she ruffled his hair. "Considering all that has happened since we met, I think it would be fair to say the same to you." "At least I do not seek out trouble deliberately," he countered, somehow managing to sniffle and look affronted at the same time. Adara, smiling sadly, hugged Theron somewhat more gently, and then kissed her again on each cheek. "I wish you fair weather, my friends, and good luck." Eben seemed to be rooted to the spot by misery, staring glumly at the ground, so Theron went over to stand beside him, while Adara kissed Lilith on both cheeks as well. It was an important custom for Edresians, indicative of true friendship, and Theron was somewhat surprised, as she thought this might be the first time that Adara had honored Lilith in such a manner. However, she also realized the likely reason for this. There was every chance now that they would never be all in one place like this again. Adara clearly did not want to let Lilith leave without making sure that she knew she was considered a part of the family they had made together. The growing lump in Theron's throat threatened to overcome her attempts to remain stoic, so she turned to Eben and patted him stolidly on the shoulder, hoping to avoid anything more emotional. "Stay safe," she told him, the lingering fear of whatever task he was undertaking with the Dean still gnawing at her, and he gave her a look that was half knowing, half heartbroken. "You as well," he replied, before engulfing her in a hug, and then kissing her on both cheeks just as Adara had done. And then, suddenly, Theron found herself with no more words to say. There was no going back. There was nothing she could say that would change what was to come, whether they would meet again or not. It seemed that their time together had ended, and that thought was enough to render her speechless with grief. Tears prickling in her eyes, she nodded at them all one last time, and then took Lilith's hand, following Vivian's path onto the ship. Though loath to look back, for fear that she would stop altogether, Theron did pause on the edge of the deck to gaze down at Eben, Adara, and Calum, where they stood huddled together, still watching. Thankfully, she was saved from having to remain there, waving like a fool, by the cry that rang out across the docks. "All aboard! All hands aboard! Set the sails!" The sailors hurried her out of the way, and Theron struggled to keep her balance, already unnerved by the ship's movements. Lilith immediately headed below decks, seeking refuge partially from the cold wind and partially from the melancholy situation. But Theron moved to the stern, still reluctant to truly say goodbye to everything she had known for so long. The docks were almost cleared, save for little knots of people being left behind, her friends among them. They looked very small from the height of the deck, but Theron could still clearly see the tears running down Calum's face, and Eben's arm around Adara's shoulders, squeezing more tightly than he usually would have. As she stood there, Lilith called out to her from the stairway, telling her to hurry below so as not to catch her death of cold, and Theron felt relief once again that the two of them had not had to part ways as well. She could not imagine that she would have been even half this composed had she been leaving Lilith behind. She did not, or possibly could not, take Lilith's advice, however. She remained on deck while they departed, and watched her friends turn to tiny smudges in the distance as the ship slowly cleared the bay. The sun set rapidly, and the sailors lit lanterns, but the vast The sun set rapidly, and the sailors lit lanterns, but the vast expanse of sea around them seemed dark enough to suck away all the light, with even the moons being shrouded by clouds. Despite the dimness and her growing queasiness, Theron stood on the prow watching the High King's Seat retreat farther and farther into the distance, until not even a speck of it remained on the horizon. She was afraid to admit, even to herself, that she was not sure she would ever see it again. The sea journey from Selvin to the High King's Seat that Theron had taken when she first made her way to the Academy had been much shorter than the passage across the Great Bay to Feldamar. She remembered that first trip vividly, the terror that she had felt with every wave, but mercifully it had not been so long that she had been expected to sleep on board. If it meant never having to set foot on a ship again, she thought that she would almost be glad to never return to the seat, despite how much she missed it. Theron had barely slept at all the night on which they had set out, dozing off for a few hours in the morning and nothing more. Vivian had invited her to come up to the deck and be introduced to some of the other mystics, but it had only resulted in Theron getting a few steps out into the open air and then immediately rushing to the edge to relieve herself of her last meal. She lay currently in a pile of ropes at the very back end of the ship, curled into a miserable ball of churning unpleasantness. Lilith, who was in contrast quite happy to enjoy the late afternoon sunshine, sat beside her, idly reading a book that she had brought with her. Occasionally she would reach over and rub Theron's back gently, which almost made everything worth it. After what seemed like an eternity, Theron felt her insides settle a little, helped by the new wisps of cloud scudding across the sun and dampening its bright glare. Gradually, afraid that even the slightest movement might set her stomach off again, she sat up, glad to be smelling fresh air instead of the musty, oiled ropes. Not much of a one for sailing, I take it, a cheerful voice said as she was getting her bearings, and she looked up to her right to see the captain. He towered over her, a muscular, black-skinned man from Feldemar, but despite his intimidating size, his eyes were kind and he smiled often. She had overheard from chatter that he was usually a merchant sailor, running trade between Feldemar, the High King's Seat, and Dorsey, but she could scarcely imagine the idea of someone spending most of their life at sea. She squinted up at him where he stood, looking out over the edge, and mustered a weak grin. "If there were a tiny spot of land beside us now, I would descend onto it and never leave." He laughed jovially. "I have never heard anyone volunteer to be marooned before, but if we find any sandbars, I shall keep it in mind." "You will have to forgive her," Lilith chimed in dryly. "This is only her second time traveling by sea, and the only other journey she made was between Selvin and the High King's Seat." "Ah, so I placed the accent aright. Well, fear not, my little tortoise, you will adjust to it after a time." She raised her eyebrows. "Tortoise?" Lilith laughed beside her. "A name commonly given in Feldemar to those who prefer the land. Those who love the sea are called turtles because of where the two creatures live." Theron had only seen such animals in picture books, although she thought there might have been a weremage at the academy at one time who favored the form of one or the other. She was struck suddenly by the realization that there were a great many animals she had only ever read about, with which she might potentially come face to face in the jungles of Feldemar.
Hey, Miak, what's happening?
Thinking of snakes and scorpions, she shuddered, wondering how people could ever feel safe. "Do you know how long the voyage will be?" she asked him, standing up cautiously. He shrugged.
Oh, Jesus, dude. I'm so sorry. That's awful.
He shrugged. "That is what I am here to find out. We have had fine weather thus far, but there is a storm behind us, and I fear it will overtake us later today." He pointed out behind her towards a swell of dark clouds gathering over what seemed to be a vast area, and Theron felt her stomach lurch again momentarily as she realized that she could not see land in any direction from here. "And the rain will slow us down?" she inquired, her heart sinking at the thought of spending more time at sea. He clapped her on the shoulder, amused. "No more than a day or two." More than a day or two. More than a day or...
Well, you're right about that. It's a pretty awful icebreaker. Really, though, man, I'm sorry to hear that.
No more than a day or two.
Not too bad.
No more than a day or two. We will be in Bandar before 4 days from now. That is certain. Lilith looked up from her book in surprise. "Bandar? Would it not be faster to sail to Yolande? That is where I have always disembarked when returning home from the sea." "Oh, home from the sea." Home from the sea. Home from the sea. "Oh, yes, most of the mystics will be docking west of Yolande," the captain explained, his gaze returning to the clouds. "A special landing area was constructed for unloading the horses and the weapons, you see. The locals were none too happy about it, I can tell you. But the bulk of the Order's forces are being carried by ships contracted from Selvin, with captains who are eager to return as soon as possible. The few of us who had business in Feldemar before being called upon by Her Majesty were given permission to keep our usual trade routes, no doubt as a way to try to lower our transport fees." Theron made an uninterested noise, more concerned with her stomach than trade matters, but Lilith frowned deeply, closing her book with a snap. "Why would people in Yolande be upset with the construction of the landing? Will it not open new trading opportunities or docking space?" The captain gave her a sideways look, assessing, and then eventually let out a deep, rumbling sigh. "You have not seen much of the world beyond your wealthy caravans, that is certain." The landing was constructed with wood purchased at a discount for the sake of Her Majesty from local lumber yards, and it will be dismantled and carted off to Ammon when the order is finished with it, so they cannot even recoup the loss. But it also makes them a target. When last I passed by Yolande, they had already been raided at least once by soldiers from Dolmun. They had been raided at least once by soldiers from Dolmun. Who knows if it has happened again? Theron leaned back against the wall behind her, appalled. The High King had truly ordered these installations built solely for the benefit of her army? And surely they could have picked some empty stretch of coastland, if it was likely to attract Dolmun's raiders, rather than the outskirts of a town full of people. While she was musing, a piercing cry rang out from the sky above them, and she looked up to see a great seabird with wings longer than she was tall, circling its way slowly down towards the ship. "Finally," the captain muttered, waving at it, and the massive bird, which was pure white except for the black tips of its wings, dived down towards them. It looked as though it was coming in too fast and would collide heavily with the deck, but at the last moment it beat its great wings several times and then transformed, revealing a young tanned weremage wearing a tight red coat that marked him as a mystic. He landed solidly on his feet as he alighted on the deck, as casually as someone else might dismount a horse. Blinking, Theron watched him make his way up to where they were standing, wondering what he had been doing. "Did you get a good look at the storm?" the captain wondering what he had been doing. "Did you get a good look at the storm?" the captain asked the newcomer, squinting at the sky once again. "Yes, and it is not good," the weremage replied, and then grinned at Theron, whose mouth was still slightly agape in shock. "Have you never seen an albatross before?" She snapped her mouth closed, trying to regain some semblance of dignity. "No, I never." "You were right," he said, turning back to the captain. "I suspect it will be upon us by sunset. A fierce little summer squall." The captain sighed again. "Thank you, Tanoon. I was hoping we could outrun it. Ah, well, a day or so longer will not do us any great harm." Theron made a face, and both men laughed at her. "Except you, of course, my little tortoise. Best you get below decks before the storm is upon us. Do not fear, this ship is sturdy, and summer storms are loud but small. We will be in no danger." Lilith laughed at the expression on her face as well as she got to her feet. "Come, you should listen to him. Storms happen all the time. If they were truly so dangerous, how would any ship make the journey across the Great Bay?" "It seems far more sensible not to try at all," Theron muttered, stomping down the stairs. She paused down on the main deck, peering out to the west, where she could see the distant smudges of other ships, and shivered as a sudden gust of cold wind brushed past her. At least there would be allies within range to come to their aid if the storm went badly, she told herself, but she was unconvinced by her own efforts at comfort. Luckily for her, Lilith was there, and put an arm around her waist. "I have sailed through many storms," she said softly, and Theron snorted. "And I have survived many things that are no more pleasant in hindsight for having lived through them." Lilith rolled her eyes. "At least the weather will likely not have a temper to rival yours." Theron sighed. "I am sorry. I just feel a great sense of foreboding. It may only be the blackness of the clouds, but I have never been so far away from land that I could not see it in any direction before." "That is what the cabins are for," Lilith countered, smiling. "You cannot see how far out we are if you cannot see the empty horizon. I stayed in my room below decks many times before I became comfortable out in the open air." "I could use some rest," Theron admitted, feeling the great weight of her exhaustion pressing down on her, and Lilith laughed. "Really? All that tossing and turning was not you attempting to dance in your sleep?" "Not on purpose," she answered, and then squared her shoulders, turning her back on the oncoming storm. "All right, then. Let me try again. All the times I deliberately set out to nap during my library sessions at the academy were training for this moment. Sky preserve me, I will sleep through this storm. Giggling, Lilith put her arm through Theron's, and they walked back towards the stairway that led to the lower areas. Theron tried not to look at the growing bank of billowing clouds in the distance as they did so, but they had a way of demanding notice. She hoped that Lilith and the captain would be right about them being harmless, even if only for her stomach's sake.
Ugh. Okay, so the next chapter is long as fuck. So I'm going to take a short break, walk around, and I will be back in a moment. Hey, we're back. What's up, Atanshi? Good to see you. Yeah, some late night audiobook editing. The exciting life of Carrot Robinson.
Chapter 11. The storm raged from shortly after sunset until morning, only dissipating some time after the sun had already risen. Theron had lain awake for what seemed like the whole night, gripping her pallet in unbridled terror with every lurch of the ship, and dozing only fitfully. Lilith took one look at her face that morning and told her in no uncertain terms to go back to bed immediately. But even now sleep eluded her, as though she was so tired that she had passed beyond the need for rest. After a few more hours of sleeplessness, she began to hear, though muffled by the multiple levels of the ship above her, a great commotion on the main deck, footsteps interspersed occasionally with shouting. Already on edge, she strained her ears as she tried to find out what was going on, and was shocked to hear several people run down the corridor right outside her door, heavy boots thudding. "Is it Dolmoon? We do not know yet. The captain says—" Theron lay still for a moment, gripped by sudden fear. The war with Dolmoon had seemed so far away until now, and she had certainly not thought to encounter them at sea. There was still trade passing between Dolmoon and the High King's Seat, was there not? How could Dolmoon risk attacking ships on this route, if they needed the trade from Dorsey and Selvin still, unless they knew that these were mystic ships bound for war? Her throat dry, memories of the attack on the Seat rose unbidden in her mind. The fire and the chaos, dead bodies in the streets, and buildings aflame. And here there would be nowhere to run but into the cold black depths of the sea. She sat bolt upright, pulling her shirt on over her head and scrabbling into her new cloak. Lilith was likely somewhere up on deck, investigating the same disturbance that had roused her, in the direct firing line of any Dolmish soldiers that they might run across. Shaking off her lightheadedness, she stumbled out the door and made her way quickly up the stairs. The air grew colder the higher she went, and she emerged into a thick blanket of fog. The mystics were milling around, most of them peering out over the sides, and many of them had weapons clutched tightly in their hands. Sailors were crawling all over the rigging, tying up most of the sails and tightening ropes, while the captain stood at the front of the ship, barking orders. Beside him were Lilith and Vivian, so Theron made her way over as well, heart pounding at the sound of several splashes in the water below them. "What is happening?" she asked when she had arrived, and Lilith turned to look at her and made a face. "You look terrible. Why are you out of bed?" "The commotion woke me." It was almost the truth. "What are they dropping into the water?" She pointed off to the port side, where one sailor was indeed dropping something over the edge, peering intently down at it in the water. "Captain Jasir has instructed his men to take down sail and check for shoaling," Vivian explained, sounding almost as tired as Theron felt.
It does take a long time to be done with a book. And then, of course, there's the old saying that no book is ever finished, it's only abandoned.
"They are dropping in a weighted rope, marked along its length with distances, to try to determine if the water here will become unexpectedly shallow."
Theron stared blankly for a moment before accepting this answer. She knew that she would never understand why this was necessary, or why shallow water would be a bad thing, especially not while she was in this frame of mind. Her eyes lingered on Vivian's face. In addition to looking exhausted, she had her hair drawn back for the first time since Theron had met her, in long, neat braids that were looped around each other to form a bun on the back of her head, which fully exposed the ghoulish burn scars on her right side. They ran all the way from her temple down to her neck, a deep purple in the center that lightened to yellowish gray on the edges.
Is something wrong?
Vivian asked her sharply, noticing her observation.
No, my apologies,
she mumbled, looking away.
I did not mean to stare. I am only very tired.
Vivian surveyed her for a few moments, her own gaze cool.
You look it.
There was a loud screech from the air above them, and many of the mystics jumped, clutching tighter at their weapons. But Theron knew what to expect this time. She watched the weremage, Tanoon, land on the deck, noticing that he was more careful this time so as not to slip on the damp timbers. "What did you see?" The captain leaned forwards, hungry for information.
The fog is extensive,
Tanoon replied, out of breath.
But that is not all I must tell you. Some of it, at least, is not natural. I do not doubt that some has been brought on by the storm, but I can sense alchemy in the air. Someone is deliberately thickening the mist. I would have tried to dispel it, but I feared I would give away our position to whoever was building it.
Captain Jasir's face grew grim. No honest sailor would willingly cause this mire. That means raiders. At once, Vivian was at the rail overlooking the lower decks, her voice suddenly full and commanding, as if she had not been weary just moments ago.
Mystics, there are raiders in the mist. Prepare to defend against boarding parties and spears. Shields to the fore, on your guard.
Do you have an elementalist on board? Jasir asked her, lifting up a heavy club that had been sitting nearby, obviously his weapon of choice. Vivian frowned.
Only Lilith. I was just about to tell her and Theron to go below.
I could use her aid, he said apologetically. Lilith lifted her chin proudly, though Theron could see her shaking slightly.
I would rather stay and help than hide, though if you need winds, I fear I may not be able to fill the sails fully.
Though Vivian gave her an exasperated look, the captain just shook his head. No, we do not need a tailwind, but if you can, try to blow off some of this accursed fog. If we cannot see our enemy, we do not stand a chance. Lilith swallowed hard, obviously intimidated by the importance of the task, but focused herself. Soon her eyes glowed with mage light as she conjured up an eddying swirl of wind that pushed ahead of the ship's prow.
Did you get a sense of which direction the alchemist was in?
Vivian asked.
Sense of which direction the alchemist was... Alchemist... The alchemist... Did you get a sense of which direction the alchemist was in?
Vivian asked Tanoon. He opened his mouth to answer, but closed it abruptly, as a sound came out of the mists, sending shivers down all of their spines. It was a high-pitched voice, at first sounding like a wailing cry, but gradually the note changed, and it became apparent that it was a wordless song. Other voices joined it, singing the same haunting melody, layer upon layer of sound, until it seemed that it was coming from all around them, as though the sea itself were keening with grief. Keep going, the captain whispered fiercely at Lilith as her magic faltered. It is the raiders. Dulmish sailors sing these hymns to pinpoint the other ships in the flotilla. We must see them before they see us. Vivian grabbed hold of Theron's arm firmly, steering her towards the stairs. But before they were halfway there, they heard the mad pealing of a bell in the far distance. It was soon followed by barely audible shouts and screams, the unmistakable sounds of battle, not boding well for the mystics on the other ships in their fleet. Darkness take them, Vivian swore, her grip on Theron's arm tightening until it hurt. Lilith redoubled her efforts as their ship crept forwards through the fog, the mystics lining the deck all growing lining the deck, mystics lining the mystics lining the deck all growing tenser by the moment. The eerie, ululating hymn being sung by the raiders permeated the air, and nothing was visible beyond the clinging fog, save for the occasional distant flash of fire from the direction of their sister ship. A yelp from Lilith broke through the hymn's strange melody. Theron whirled towards her, as did Vivian, and noticed that the mage light was gone from her eyes. "Someone has dispelled my magic!" Vivian shoved Theron towards the stairs back into the hold, grabbing Lilith as well, but all three women cried out as they felt the gathering of magic off to the starboard side. It was a great blossoming rose of power, one that Theron knew enough to associate with an elementalist's fireball. "Enemy mage! Brace yourselves! Away from the edge!" Vivian screamed, but it was too late. The flames struck the wooden ship with a force that knocked Theron off her feet, the terrible wave of heat making her retch as it carried the stench of burning flesh and smoke past her. In the next instant, everything descended into chaos. With raucous laughter, the Dolmish raiders seemed to appear out of nowhere, visible now with the fog burned off by the fireball. The mystics rallied desperately to recover from the opening attack, but the raiders were already hurling thick, barbed spears, not giving any quarter. In response, Tanoon leaped into the air in his albatross form, shrieking indignantly, and tore at the Dolmoon ship's dark gray sails with his great beak. Theron struggled to her feet, still coughing. "Lilith!" she bellowed, trying to be heard over the tumult. The fireball had been enormous, far bigger than any she had seen the fire mages cast at the academy. The idea that Lilith might have been caught in it. She dodged past the mystics as they swarmed near the bulwarks, those with bows firing back at the raiders, while others threw their own spears or held shields for defense. The air was thick with smoke, so much so that she could not see along the full length of the ship, and as she stumbled forwards, the charred timber of the deck in front of her fell through, no more than wreckage. She darted back, arms windmilling to keep her balance, and then gasped as she felt the enemy elementalist drawing in more power. But before the fire mage could cast again, a blast of mind magic rocketed forwards and shook the enemy ship. Theron, dazed, looked up to see that it had come from Vivian, who stood on the balcony once more, her own eyes aglow with mage light. "I see you now, traitor!" she cried, and Theron shuddered as she felt Vivian gathering her magic. The elementalist pushed back, and between the two, Theron felt more raw power than she had ever witnessed, being wasted on nothing more than dispelling burgeoning spells. It made her dizzy, and that coupled with the acrid smoke and coppery scent of blood in the air caused her head to begin aching. She skirted around the hole in the deck, trying to pull herself together, and made for the stairs. She called out for Lilith again, and hope flooded through her when she heard the girl respond faintly from somewhere up past Vivian. Sailors hurried around her with buckets, trying to put out the fires, but Theron fought her way up the steps against her body's wishes. She almost collapsed with relief when she saw that Lilith stood there, looking singed but untroubled, reciting the incantations for her spells under her breath as she tried to aid Vivian. Theron then took a moment to regain her composure, wishing she had had any sleep at all in the past 2 nights, and hurried over to the edge to join in the fray. From up here she could see some of the damage the fireball had done to the ship and the mystics who had caught the brunt of it, and it was not pleasant. Charred bodies smoked where they had fallen across the blackened and blistered wood, while the water beneath the edge was littered with lost shields. The edge was littered while the water beneath the edge was littered with lost shields, the sea foam stained murk gray by the ashes. Furious, she raked claws of her magic along the ranks of the Dolmish soldiers, knocking them into each other, and yanked at them, pulling 1 or 2 off the ship into the sea. She, Lilith, and Vivian had been powerless to stop the growing fireball, unable to see the enemy mage in the fog. She wondered how many other ships had fallen prey to this same kind of calculated attack, and felt bile rise in her throat as she wondered if the other mystic ship they had heard in the distance had had any mages on board to try to defend it as they were doing. One raider, watching his compatriots get pushed around by an invisible force, looked around for the source of the magic and then seized a spear from beside him when he spotted Theron. He hurled it at her with frightening speed, and she backed away, holding up a shield made from her will. Though the weapon bounced off, the impact still knocked her over, but suddenly Lilith was there, growling. "You will not harm her," Lilith cried out in fury, and then let fly with a lightning bolt that struck the man square between the eyes. He keeled over, instantly. Beside them, Vivian finally seemed to be overcoming the enemy fire mage, with her hands twisted into vicious claws as she crushed the woman in a vise-like grip of her power. Captain Jasir appeared beside Theron, his club sticky with something she did not want to think about, and pulled her to her feet as a shadow passed overhead. "You girls should get away from the fighting." Before she could argue, there was an ugly, croaking caw from above them, and the shadow that she had at first thought must be Tenoon swooped down at the group of them. It was a huge black vulture, its feet armed with clusters of terrible claws, and the fearsome saw-edged teeth that bristled in its beak made her certain that it had to be a weremage. Vivian was clearly its target, judging by its angle of approach, but on the way towards her it seemed happy to bowl over anyone else unlucky enough to be in its path. Theron tripped and tumbled backwards down the stairs in her attempts to get away from it, crying out as her elbows, knees, and back joined her stomach in being horribly bruised. She landed prone on the deck, rattled, and then peeled her face slowly off the floor, trying to regain her bearings. Somewhat distantly, she realized that she was face to face with a dead sailor, his lifeless eyes staring at the sky and several thick black arrows embedded in his chest. Shock gripped her like the claws of some terrible beast, and she struggled to move her limbs to back away. This was different from the attack on the High King's seat. There had been devastation in the streets then, it was true, but the academy students had been protected from it for the most part by their instructors. She had not had to smell a dead man's burns or pull herself out of the blackened blood oozing from underneath his corpse. That horrible cawing rang out again, and she shook off the stupor, forcing herself to stand. The weremage leaped from their ship over towards its allies, drawn away by some other aspect of the battle. Theron gasped as she realized that it was Tenoon, who was now leaping about as a great cat, oblivious to the mage's approach. He had all but conquered the back half of the Dolmish ship with his vicious claws, and the enemy weremage obviously meant to stop him from doing any more damage. "Tenoon, watch out!" she screamed, her voice hoarse, but he did not hear, and the vulture slammed into him. He yowled in pain as the vulture's claws bit into his flesh, and writhed furiously as he tried to escape from its horrible beak. Theron reached out with her magic and grabbed onto one of its legs, flailing wildly in an attempt to shake him free from its grip. Barking gutturally in surprise, the weremage released Tenoon, and he sprang away deftly, transforming back into his albatross form to escape. Theron kept her hold on the vulture, straining mightily to keep it off balance, and slammed it down into the deck several times when it tried to take flight. Unwilling to let the weremage go, she tried pulling it back off the enemy ship and into the ocean, but regretted that idea immediately as the vulture turned itself towards her quicker than she could adjust the direction of her pull. It sprang forwards, claws outstretched, and shrieked triumphantly as it felt her grip slip away. She jumped back and tripped over the dead sailor, too breathless even to scream as the monster bore down on her. But then, with a great screech and a cascade of feathers, Tenoon rammed into it from off to her right, clacking his beak angrily, and knocked it into the mast beside them. She saw immediately that he would not be able to fight the other weremage one-on-one. There was a heavy spear now protruding from his breast, and already he seemed to be flagging. She struggled back to her feet for what seemed like the 1,000th time that morning as the vulture righted itself, and watched in horror as it transformed into a giant boar, its feathers rippling and reforming into thickened gray skin. It began to charge towards the two of them, and Theron struck out desperately with her magic, trying to lift it or turn it away. Bellowing in rage, its raw strength pushed through her feeble reserves of energy like a shark through water, and she stood there gasping as it approached, with nothing left to do. Out of nowhere, Vivian appeared in its path ahead of them. The mystic stood her ground as the maddened weremage continued its charge, apparently unperturbed. In a flash, she dodged its tusks, and Theron felt her gathering a great deal of magic around one of her hands. Then, before the boar could react, Vivian brought that fist down sharply on the top of its skull, and the extra mentalism force behind her punch sent the creature crashing to the floor, with a sickening crack. The impact had obviously knocked the weremage unconscious, because the boar form was stripped away, leaving only an extremely pasty, white-skinned man, covered in blood-red tattoos. Vivian, her lips curled into a snarl, kicked him over the side of the ship. "Quickly," she commanded, taking hold of Theron's arm. "Help me bring down the mast." The crushing weight that Vivian brought down on the mast of the enemy ship stunned Theron for a moment, but she added to it as best she could, concentrating on snapping rigging and smaller beams, while Vivian simply let loose with all the power she had left. A bolt of lightning struck the mast midway up its height, and Theron felt relief once more that Lilith was well enough to be casting spells. Eventually, its timbers groaning horribly, the mast gave way and came crashing down onto the mess of the Dolmish ship's deck, before promptly catching fire at Lilith's command. Silence fell, or at least relatively. There was coughing and crying and the ever-present roar of the sea, but the blood pounding in Theron's ears had died down as her energy seeped away. Boots thudded across the deck as mystics regrouped, checking on their friends, and the captain shouted for the deckhands to let down the sails and hasten away. A burbling sound caught her ear, and Theron looked down to see Tinu caught her ear, and Theron looked down. A burbling sound caught her ear, and Theron looked down to see Tinoon back in human form, blood spilling from his mouth as he struggled to breathe. She hurried to his side, hoping mayhap she could hold his wounds closed until a healer could see him, but the spearhead was embedded deep in his chest, its cruel barbs warning against any attempts at removing it. The flesh around the wound churned as he tried to heal himself, but with the weapon still inside him, it was a fight he could not win, unlike their greater battle, in which he had done much to secure victory. "Just stay still," she told him gently, but the look in his eyes made it clear that he knew there was nothing anyone could do. "At least we—" he gurgled, and then broke off to try to. Anyone could do. "At least we—" he gurgled, and then broke off to try to draw another breath. "At least we got the bastards." He let out a hideous, wet, hacking cough, and his body went limp, falling back against the wall. Still the spear protruded from his body, as sharp and as cruel as the weremage's talons of which Theron had been so afraid. Numbly, she realized that she was covered in his blood. It was all over her hands, and she could feel some running down her face as well, from where he had been spluttering. She stood woodenly, and looked back at the now blazing remains of the Dolmish ship, watching it burn. Yes, we did.
Done chapter. Yum. I think I got one more in me tonight. Maybe two? The next two are pretty long. I gotta be up at 7 for a Patreon stream. But I can definitely do one more. We'll see how I feel after that. Bum, bum. Nice. Wait, really? Holy shit. That chapter was very fast. That's great. All right. New recording session. One chapter. Garrett! You lazy shit!
Chapter 12. Chapter 12. Their ship limped the rest of the way to Bandar, taking 6 days instead of the 4 that the captain had predicted, thanks to the damage done by the Dolmish raiders. The mood among the sailors was tense, with Captain Jasir prowling up and down the bow at all hours of the day, watching for more attacks. Vivian was grim and silent, her offer of introducing Theron to the other mystics having evaporated, much like the fog. Theron spent a great deal of the rest of the journey sleeping, partially out of exhaustion and partially because it was easier than dealing with the frayed tempers of everyone else on board. While it was not the way she would have wished for her fears to be assuaged, the sea now seemed less frightening to her, and sleep came easier, to Lilith's relief. Occasionally, in the middle of the night when no light penetrated through the walls of their room, Theron would wake with a vision swimming in her mind of Tinoon or the dead sailor she had tripped over. More horrors to add to her growing pile, alongside the murder victims from Ezra's rampage at the Academy, and the inside of the blinders she had worn while the mystics saw to her with knives.
Boy, listen, okay. My voice sounds really good in this recording. This was a good recording day. Why did I only do one chapter? What the fuck was wrong with me?
But then Lilith would sigh in her sleep or turn over beside her, reminding Theron that reality was here and now. She could not even imagine how she would have handled any of this had Lilith not been there with her, a small piece of home in her arms. It was early morning, the pink-tinged sunlight adding to the already stifling late summer heat, when they came within sight of the shores of Feldamar. Theron was woken by the cacophony of boots on the deck again, and feared that they might be under attack once more, though there was none of the shouting from the other day. She slid out of bed, trying and failing not to wake Lilith as she went, and the two of them dressed and made their way up to the outside world, hearts heavy with dread. As soon as they were out on the deck, though, their fears eased, as the mystics all seemed to be in a state of quiet celebration as they stared at the distant coastline. "At last," Lilith murmured happily, smiling at the shores of her homeland. As they came closer, they began to see other ships. They began to As they came closer, they began to see other ships, though Lilith assured Theron that there was a well-used trading route between Bandar and Eastern Selvan, and that they were not more raiders. There was no sign of any of the other ships in the Mystic fleet that had been headed towards Bandar instead of Yolande, but Theron told herself feebly that they had lost a lot of time, and it might have been possible that the others had arrived days ahead of them. Bandar itself was unlike any place that Theron had ever seen. It was set in the lee of a tall cliff that formed the western edge of a small bay, with much of the city situated out over the water. Some of its buildings were carved into the nooks and crannies in the rock face, and some others sat atop the cliff above, but the majority of it rose out of the ocean on towering stone columns, with delicate bridges passing between the high rows of houses, while the citizens made their way around in small boats that paddled along lanes of water. The top floor of every building seemed to house a garden, with green vines and flowers of all hues draping out lazily over the umber stone, their vibrant blossoms accentuated by the dark yellowish-brown. Some larger structures even sported lawns and had great trees transplanted on top of them. Lilith laughed at the look of awe on Theron's face.
What, baby?
I'm just saying, if you're getting up at 7:30, you should go to bed soon.
Yeah, I think this is going to be my last chapter. Do you want to say hi to stream?
Oh. My zipper's down.
Oh. Fix that. Glad you did that on
Hi,
camera.
stream. Yes. I have a zipper that goes down, just like you.
I'm like anybody. I zip my pants up one leg at a time.
No, you don't zip your pants up.
I do, like everybody else.
One leg. And what kind of pants are you wearing?
They're really rip-off chaps.
Oh.
Assless rip-off chaps.
Hi, Hannah. Hannah?
Itanchi?
Yeah. Glasses.
Hannah.
I need...
Itanchi.
It...
Where are your glasses?
They're in the bathroom.
Okay.
It's all fuzz right now.
All right. This is probably my last chapter. I might do another one, but I think it's going to be this one.
Hey.
Hey, nice shirt. I like it.
Oh. I love this man.
I love this woman. I got to get back to it.
Okay, you sure you want to love this woman?
Megan Robinson. This is a family-friendly stream.
It's never family friendly.
It never is family-friendly.
On the eastern side of the bay, however, the high cliffs descended towards the mouth of a gargantuan river delta, a twisting maze of silt-stained water and mangrove swamps that wound around a great many tiny islands. The vast wash extended so far into the distance that Theron could barely see the other side, but she did notice that on the other side. But she did notice that on the very edge of her vision there squatted a stout black fortress with a tower that looked impossibly high rising out of it. It was far enough away that all Theron could make out was the shape, like a thick black box, but there seemed to be a fire burning at the top of the tower, and tiny smudges that were boats sailing around the riverways at its skirts. "Is that Ammon?" she asked, pointing at it, wishing she had had a chance to look at a map before they had set out. Lilith's eyes narrowed, and she shook her head. "No, Ammon is many days' ride inland. That is Vaxom, the great northern warlike fortress of Dulmoon. It marks the edge of their territory, the border that they share with Feldamar." "It is so close." Theron shuddered, memories of the battle still fresh in her mind. "It will come no closer," Captain Jasir said bleakly, appearing behind them. "The foundations of Bandar were laid centuries ago by the last wizard king, Nyala, at the height of her power. They will not be broken by the armies of traitors." Comforted somewhat, Theron returned to her scrutiny of the approaching city, though it was not much cheerier a landscape. The people of Bandar seemed weighed down by the tension of the war, and many faces glared angrily at their ship from windows and walkways as it passed by on their way to the docks. The harbor master was not much friendlier, demanding to know when the mystics would be leaving and whether the ship was officially sanctioned by the High King or merely a transport vessel. Apparently the captain's responses were enough to satisfy him in the end, but the atmosphere was distinctly chilly as they all disembarked, with Theron and Lilith once again carrying their luggage between them. Once they were in the city proper, Lilith's green dress drew more than a few glances, but it did not seem to do much to soften the mood. They labored their way up the cliff, along winding paths carved out of the rock, until at last the ground flattened out and the houses made way for stables and military fortifications. There seemed to be a large number of soldiers, including many watchers on the outer walls, and all of them were armed with spears and shields and were giving the mystics suspicious looks. Theron could see now why Lilith's insistence that they would need her to mediate with the people of Feldamar had been accepted, watching her smooth everyone's ruffled feathers as she was forced to step in on an argument between Vivian and a stablemaster about buying mounts. Much as Theron hated the idea of Lilith throwing around her weight like a typical gold bag, it would certainly be better than walking the rest of the way to Ammon. She just hoped that the humidity in the air here on the coast would not follow them as they made their way farther inland. 3 days later, inland. 3 days later, Theron sat wilting in her saddle as the blasted heat sapped away all of her energy. The air was warm and sticky, as though they had wandered into a steaming room, and many brightly colored insects went their merry way around them, buzzing insistently. It had passed into autumn the day before, but apparently the sweltering jungle had not received the message, and she found it almost as hard to sleep as she had at sea during the storm. Vivian seemed to be similarly indisposed by the weather, her pale skin reddened by the sun, and when their group stopped to water the horses, both Theron and Vivian waded into the river with their mounts, splashing the water over their faces and arms. Lilith stayed atop her horse, laughing at them, alongside a stout mystic from Idris, who was also grinning at their discomfiture. "My wife is from southern Dorsey, and she was exactly the same when she came home to Almanzil to meet my parents," he commented, amused. Lilith giggled. "It must be very boring in Selvin if any amount of weather is too much for you all." Theron groaned, scrubbing at her face with the cold water. "It will not be like this all through the year, will it? I fear I will perish if it is." "Ammon sits on a wide, flat plain, or so I have heard," Vivian replied wearily, positioning herself so that her horse shielded her from the sun as it drank greedily from the river. "Once we escape from these infernal jungles, it should be less humid.
Or at least that is my hope. How much farther will it be until we reach the fortress?
Theron asked, managing to drag herself back into the saddle with some effort.
6 days, if the weather holds. The jungle should thin out within 3.
That is not so bad, she responded, though her heart sank in anticipation of 3 more days of this anguish. The Adresian mystic laughed. You are assuming the roads will be clear, Vivian. Here in the north, they say that every second day the roads are covered by mudslides. It is all the rain, you see. Theron scowled at the back of his extremely cheerful head, wishing he had remained quiet. It was bad enough that they had to ride at all, as her knowledge of the saddle was thin at best, and her fondness for it even thinner. But she was certain she would have been happier were she not handling everything far worse than everyone else. The last thing she needed was to be stranded here if the roads were destroyed. She wondered how anybody could stand to live in Feldamar at all if they could not even travel reliably.
I have never seen Ammon,
Lilith said brightly, in an attempt to lighten the mood as they returned to the road that led northwards through the trees.
Can you tell us anything of it? Very little that deals with the fortress specifically,
Vivian replied, shading her face with one hand.
I have never been there either. It is some 25 leagues or so from the border with Dulmoon, though it is some way south of the current engagement between Dulmoon's forces and the High King's army. It will be safe, which is why it was chosen as our primary staging ground.
Theron slapped at a whining mosquito that landed on her neck.
Will there be many new recruits? A few as new as you,
Vivian answered wryly.
Though, yes, there will be many young mystics who have not yet been blooded in wars. They and you will receive training and possibly experience while there. I do not expect many forces to leave the fortress for several months at least after we arrive.
Theron thought about this as she fanned at her face with her hand, musing. It seemed at least that she would not be sent immediately to the front line of the war, which came as a relief. The term blooded made her shiver, though. She knew what it meant, and that it was often used to describe more veteran members of the High King's army as well, but after the battle with Dulmoon's forces at sea, she certainly felt blooded. It did not seem a badge of honor.
As a mage, you will have more training to undertake than most of the recruits,
Vivian continued, not noticing her reaction.
There are several high-ranking mentalists that I know of who will be in Ammon, but I believe that for convenience you will likely be apprenticed to me.
Theron brightened somewhat at that, but then frowned.
More magical training? What for? Is the Academy's education not good enough?
Vivian laughed.
Most wizards are not trained for real battle. They might learn self-defense, or find ways to apply their ordinary training to war, but they do not train for it specifically. The mystics will change that.
Lilith made a thoughtful noise.
What about me? Do you think I could learn something like that while in Ammon? Why? Do you expect to need it?
Vivian asked curiously, giving her a look.
We hardly send our ambassadors into the fray. I was in the fray on board your ship,
Lilith retorted hotly.
If I am in danger just by traveling with you, why should I not learn?
Vivian fell silent, apparently considering.
You make a good point, again. I will ask around once we reach the fortress. Our own recruits will take priority, however. Do you know who was appointed Chancellor at Ammon after that business in Dorsey?
The Adresian mystic broke in, sounding curious, and Vivian grunted in response.
Karan of the family Vordith. It will be interesting to see if he is as disagreeable as all the tales tell.
The two mystics fell into conversation about their new commander, who apparently had quite the reputation for being bad with people but excellent at war. Theron did not know whether this comforted her or made her feel worse. She caught Lilith looking at her and flashed a brief, strained smile, suspecting that Lilith's request to be trained for war had more to do with the fact that she intended to follow Theron wherever she would go than any kind of residual fear of danger. That was something that did worry her, the idea of Lilith following her to the battlefield. Thankfully, they were to have several months of training before it came to any of that, or at least they would if both they and the roads could survive this accursed Feldemarian weather. Theron leaned back in her saddle and closed her eyes, wishing she were an alchemist, so that she might cool the air, and suddenly found herself missing Eben and Caleb keenly, and Adara. She sighed, wondering how she could possibly describe the events of their journey thus far in a letter, and grimaced when she thought about how much of it remained. She hoped that there would be sufficient amounts of parchment in Ammon.
Wow. I'm really proud of that chapter. That was good. Chapter 13 done. Or 12, rather. I think I got one more in me. Uno mas, and then we end off for the night. Another one chapter.
Chapter 13. Chapter 13. After 3.5 days' travel, the jungle gave way to gentler grasslands, interspersed with infrequent trees, just as Vivian had promised. Though less overbearingly wet and sticky, the air was still warm, and the landscape was entirely new to Theron. The plains of Selvin that they had passed through briefly on her trip to the High King's Seat were lowlands, long, flat stretches of land that were well watered primarily because of their proximity to the sea. It seemed, conversely, that the entirety of Feldamar was sloped gently upwards, so the air here felt thinner was sloped Feldamar was sloped gently upwards, so the air here felt thinner than any she had known before. Lilith, amused, had assured her that it was perfectly safe to breathe, though she did admit that she preferred the western lowlands of her home kingdom to these steppes. Theron, despite never having seen the rest of Feldamar, was inclined to agree. Despite the overall slope, the land seemed utterly devoid of any kind of drainage, so rain collected in stagnant pools and formed reeking marshland in the hollows between hills, and the turf was often a thin layer of grass over deep mud. No matter how hard she tried, Theron found she could never quite get all of the muck off her clothes. This was made even worse after a day or so, when they were forced to ride into a heavy rainstorm that had blown in from the east, turning the road into a tiny causeway of solid ground amidst a sea of oozing sludge as the mud overtook the plains. Theron spent the entire time clutching her saddle tightly, petrified that a landslide might occur at any moment. The water brought with it clouds of tiny stinging midges, and they in turn brought hundreds upon hundreds of incessantly croaking frogs, so that the air was alive with a cacophony at all times. The Adresian mystic, whose name was Yarshun, began to have trouble finding them safe places to camp amidst all the boggy ground, so Theron could not even catch up on any of her missed sleep. All in all, it had been a thoroughly miserable trip by the time their small band caught up with the rest of the mystics on the road, the larger group having been slowed considerably by the days-long storm. Days-long storm. A days-long storm. Yarshun, Vivian, and the other adult mystics who had been with them all seemed to visibly relax upon reuniting with their fellows, but Theron felt herself growing tense as they came upon the giant swath of red cloaks that covered the road as far as the eye could see. She told herself that someday that splash of color would no longer instinctively make her nervous, but that day did not seem like it would come any time soon.
"Do not take those off just yet,"
Vivian told her when they had made camp for the night, and she had just reached down to remove her boots.
"Come with me, and I will introduce you to some of the people you will be working with."
Theron made a face, not particularly enthused by that idea, but Lilith nudged her.
"Go on. The more names you have for faces, the less overwhelming it will be once we reach the fortress."
Sighing, Theron looked longingly at their tent for a few moments, but eventually gave in, falling in step glumly behind Vivian.
"You should try not to look quite so surly."
Vivian frowned in disapproval.
"You cannot be a part of the Order without acknowledging the rest of us. Someday you may face enemies alongside us, and they may not be uniformed like the soldiers we fought at sea were. You will want to know who is with you and who against, whatever prejudices you may have."
Despite the admonishment about her grumpiness, Theron merely grunted sourly and glowered at Vivian's back. The implication that her misgivings were out of line was frustrating, especially since, for all she knew, Vivian might take her directly to one or both of the mystics that had been her torturers. But her displeasure lightened somewhat as they went. Vivian was not simply parading her before every mystic in the vast camp, instead specifically seeking out many of the mages and purposefully avoiding some others. It seemed that Theron was being introduced only to those who Vivian knew well, which at least had the benefit of often providing common ground, and she was asked many questions about her training at the academy and which instructors remained there and which had left. Several of them inquired apprehensively about Vivian's scars, which surprised Theron. It seemed that whatever had caused them must have happened recently, given how many of Vivian's acquaintances were shocked by her appearance. For her part, Vivian smiled sadly at each of their concerns, and told them merely that serving the High King always held its perils. Another common topic of discussion was the attack by the Dolmish raiders, which many of those in the larger group had not yet heard about. Theron wondered if any of the mages they spoke to might have known Noon, but Vivian did not mention him, and it seemed presumptuous to ask without knowing them better. They met up with one particular mage, a short, stout man from Wavemount, who Vivian was delighted to see, going so far as to hug him.
Theron, this is Mycano of the family Cora,
she said, laughing, as he lifted her off the ground.
He is also a mentalist. We studied in the same year at the academy.
How long has it been? Mycano grinned widely as he set Vivian back on her feet. I fear I have not seen you once since those days.
Rarely did I have cause to go to Wavemount, and it seems you hardly left there,
Vivian replied wryly, and he laughed again.
Well, you know my family. They feel better having me around.
He is a cousin to a powerful merchant family,
Vivian explained airily, the happiest that Theron had ever heard her.
Mycano, this is Theron, a new recruit. She will likely be training with me once we reach Ammon.
He inspected her closely at that comment, narrowing his wide brown eyes as he looked her over.
She seems like a fine girl. I have no doubt she will fit in perfectly.
Theron smiled at him, embarrassed. She could already see why Vivian liked him so much. She knew it should have rankled her that a gold bag would simply assume that everyone would find the Mystics to be a perfect new home, but his warmth was so genuine that she instead felt reassured. She found herself hoping that she might see him around in the future, and realized suddenly that this was exactly the reason that both Vivian and Lilith had suggested she do this. Not that she would admit to them that they had been right, of course.
Do you have any advice for me, one mentalist to another?
She asked him, and he chuckled.
Be mindful of the Chancellor, Quran. Rumor has it that nobody has ever made him laugh, or even crack a smile. Follow his orders to the letter when he gives them, and you should do well.
He says that as though you should not follow all of your officers' orders,
Vivian commented dryly, and he laughed once more.
Oh, Vivian, you know as well as I that any girl in your tutelage will learn the finer points of politics and which officers can be ignored.
Do not give her ideas,
Vivian chided him gently.
She must learn to follow orders at all before she can know which ones to break.
Theron snorted. If you had heard anything about my time at the academy, you would know that I am already proficient at both skills.
Ah, what a scoundrel she seems,
Mycano exclaimed, enjoying himself.
I see why you have taken her under your wing, Vivian.
Vivian gave Theron a look, but smiled at him.
She certainly shows promise.
How is the academy these days?
Mycano took Theron's hands in his own, his eyes sparkling.
Is old Sorlin the weremage still the dean? We used to joke that he would never leave.
She laughed. No, there have been two since him, though I believe he still lives in the city somewhere. First there was Cyrus of the family Drayden, and then after Dolmun attacked the seat, a new dean had to be found. Currently the position is held by Zane of the family Foredar. He is... Theron broke off, confused, as Vivian shuddered beside her, rocking almost as though she had been struck by a blow. The woman's already pale skin was now as white as moon's light, and she clenched her hands into tightly balled fists. After a moment, she seemed to notice that Theron and Mycano were staring at her, and she determinedly brought herself back under control.
I am sorry,
she grated, taking a deep breath.
It has been a long day.
Theron frowned, not sure what to think. She could have sworn that it was the mention of Dean Foredar's name that had so affected Vivian, and not some sudden onset of exhaustion, but it did not seem like the right time to countermand or question her. She wondered if Vivian and the Dean had some kind of history, and vaguely thought of writing to ask Eben if she could remember it. Vivian seemed to rally herself back to cheerfulness, albeit with some difficulty, as they continued talking, aided no doubt by Maikano's radiant kindness. Theron, however, noticed another mystic, a hooded man sitting off by himself to the side of one of the camps, watching them intently. He was close enough that he might have heard what they had all been talking about, and when his cold eyes met hers for a moment, she was certain that he had been listening. She shivered, unsure of his motives, and Vivian noticed, following her gaze. A frown crossed her face momentarily, but then she turned back to Maikano, smiling again, somewhat more forced this time.
I fear we must cut short our visit tonight, my friend. I look forward to seeing you more often once we reach Ammon.
Of course. You must get yourselves to bed. His smile as he hugged her and shook Theron's hands was genuine. The scouts say the storm will last another day at least, so go and enjoy your dry tents. Vivian took Theron's arm as she was about to turn back towards their section of the camp, and spoke in a low voice, so quiet that even Theron could barely hear.
That man you were looking at, was he listening to us?
Theron nodded, and Vivian made a noise in her throat, small and uncertain, almost like she was afraid. Even under the pervasive cold of the storm, Theron felt her blood chill, alarmed by the idea that there was some other member of the Order that Vivian, who would face down charging weremages without fear, was perturbed by.
I see. Let us speak with him then.
One hand still clamped firmly around Theron's arm, Vivian pulled her over towards the mysterious mystic, who was still alone by the fire. As they approached, he stood up, becoming even more imposing. He was tall, much taller than she had expected, given how he had looked when hunched over, and lean, with an array of knives and curved swords strapped to his belts underneath his thick red cloak. His dark brown eyes were set deep in his face, like small beads of jet, and chin-length black hair fell like feathers around his sharp, pointed features. He might have been handsome, if not for his grim expression and the deep air of suspicion about him. As it was, Theron did not appreciate being any closer to him than she had been before, and hung back behind Vivian as much as she was able.
Is there something you need, Naro?
Vivian asked him, her croaky voice dripping with feigned politeness. The man gave her a long, cool stare before responding.
You seemed distressed. I was merely making sure that everything was all right.
If anything, his words appeared to set Vivian even more on edge, and her nostrils flared in anger despite the chilly civility in her voice.
How very astute of you to have picked up on that from over here.
He smiled at her, though it did not reach his eyes.
Oh, I'm quite observant indeed. You would be surprised to learn what I've seen, I'm sure.
Vivian's sharp intake of breath caught Theron off guard, and she wondered what on earth the hidden conversation that the two of them were really having was about. She shuffled her feet awkwardly, thinking to try to take her leave, as she in this one night had now had more than enough socialization with mystics to last a lifetime.
Theron,
Vivian said quickly, taking a firmer hold of her arm.
Please let me introduce Naro, who you may or may not remember from your time in the cells. He was acting as warden that day, though he does many things for the Order, many of them too dark to mention in polite company. You met some of his compatriots during the business with the murders at the Academy, as I understand it.
Theron's heart thumped into a panic as she immediately understood Vivian's meaning. Her knees felt weak, and once again she felt the phantom pain of the knives as they played across her skin, exacerbated by Vivian's grip on her arm. Trembling, she inspected his face more closely, trying to tell if she had indeed met him before. However, he did not look familiar, nor did his dark-skinned, fine-fingered hands look like those that had held the knives that had tormented her. She closed her eyes, head swimming, and tried to pull herself back together, focusing on the present to try hauling herself out of those memories. When she opened them again, Naro was staring at her, his expression just as unreadable as before. I am tired, she mumbled awkwardly, taking another step away from him. I should get some rest. She slipped out of Vivian's grip and hurried back to her tent, quickly removing her boots and ducking inside before anyone could tell her not to. Lilith lay on their bedroll, already dozing, and Theron watched her sleep for a while in an effort to calm herself down. She tried to reassure herself that the evening had at least been fruitful in learning the names of some mystics that she could trust, but she could not shake the feeling that the more important piece of information had been about one to avoid. She did not know why Vivian feared Naro precisely, but given what he did for a living, she was willing to believe that it was justified. That it was justified. Was justified. That it was justified. She was willing to believe that it was justified.
Chapter 13 done. And I am done for the evening. 23 chapters to do tomorrow. I think I can handle that. Bounce. Okay, pretty good speed on the last couple of chapters. Current best estimate is 8 hours of work tomorrow to finish this sucker, which I think is very doable. I should be streaming between 8:30 and 9 in the morning. Oh, right. Toss a raid before we go to bed. Go say hi to Dragomir. Ugh. That will feel good tonight. Thanks for hanging out, Tanchi. Miak, good to see you. And I will catch y'all another time, I suppose. Bye.
That's odd. How did the water get into the barrel by itself?